I want you to try a little exercise with me. Just close your eyes for a second, assuming you're in a place where you can safely do that.
Probably not while driving, right?
Right, definitely not while driving.
Yeah.
But if you can, just picture your absolute favorite fantasy world. You know the exact one I'm talking about.
Oh, I've got mine right now.
Yeah. It's that place you first encountered in some weathered paperback. Or maybe you were rolling dice around a table with your friends.
The one with the worn-out map on the very first page.
Exactly. The map. It's a world filled with magic and, mythical creatures soaring through the sky, grand ancient castles clinging to impossible cliffs, just boundless, limitless imagination.
It's a great feeling.
It really is. Think about how it feels to get totally lost in that world. I mean, the physical sensation of opening the cover, tracing that map with your finger, and feeling the real world just kind of, melt away.
It's a very specific, almost intoxicating feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Because it's that complete, uninterrupted immersion where you forget you're even sitting in a chair or commuting on a train.
You're not just looking at a screen anymore.
Right. You aren't just reading words. You are actively walking through a vibrant, breathing ecosystem. You are completely transported.
You're literally feeling the cold wind coming off those fictional mountains.
Exactly.
But here is the massive paradox that we are going to explore today. The secret ingredient, the absolute core foundation that makes this completely made-up world actually believable to your brain, is strict, unyielding, real-world science.
Which is wild because it sounds totally counterintuitive to, well, a lot of creators.
It really does.
You hear the word fantasy and your brain immediately jumps to, freedom from rules.
Right. You think, I have wizards, I have dragons. Why do I care about gravity or, atmospheric pressure?
Yeah, but the reality of creating a compelling world is entirely the opposite. The magic only actually shines when it's set against a backdrop of rigid reality.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because today, we are doing a deep dive into this really fascinating text called Scientific Foundations for Realistic Fantasy Cartography.
It's such a great source.
It is. We're looking at a collection of foundational principles that outline exactly how this works. And for you, the listener, today's mission is essentially to uncover the hidden architectural blueprint of storytelling.
The nuts and bolts of it all.
Exactly. Whether you are actively trying to write a novel, or maybe you're prepping a sprawling tabletop campaign for your friends, or honestly, even if you just want to understand the psychology behind why certain epic stories pull you in.
Well, others just leave you feeling vaguely disoriented, right?
Yes. So we're going to explore how real-life physical laws govern the absolute best fictional landscapes.
And the stakes here are surprisingly high for anyone trying to build a world.
How so?
Well, even for an audience member trying to enjoy one, there's a profound psychological relationship between the creator's limitless imagination and the audience's very limited reality-based experience.
Oh, I like that. Think of a masterful fantasy world like an intricate magic trick.
Okay, a magic trick.
Yeah, the illusion itself, like the levitation or the vanishing act, it only works if the stage it's being performed on obeys the basic laws of physics.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. If the magician's table floats when it's not supposed to, the trick is instantly ruined because your brain just stops trusting the environment.
It pulls you right out of the moment.
There's actually a brilliant analogy I came across while prepping for this deep dive. Think of a child playing make-believe in the backyard.
Oh, yeah, when they're totally in the zone.
Yes. When they are truly in the zone, fighting imaginary dragons with a stick, it takes them a few seconds to even acknowledge you calling their name. They're locked into their reality.
They're fully committed.
But if a creator doesn't build the bridge between their imagination and the reader's expectation of reality, the reader experiences this profound cognitive dissonance.
And the term often used for that dissonance in world-building circles is nausea.
Nausea. Like physical sickness.
Yeah, it's not just that the story becomes boring. It's a visceral, almost physical rejection by the human brain.
Wow, so your brain is just rejecting the world.
Exactly. Your brain is a supercomputer, right?
Yeah.
It's constantly running background checks on reality. It's always asking, does this make sense?
Does this align with my lifetime of observing the real world?
Right. When you watch an incredible 3-hour fantasy epic and you need that moment during the end credits to just sit there in the dark theater and adjust to the real world.
Oh, I know that exact feeling.
Yeah, before you can even speak again. That means the world building passed the background check.
But if it fails?
If the world is disorganized, if the fundamental rules of the landscape don't make sense, the brain's constant questioning of reality just overrides the narrative completely.
It's like watching a movie with terrible CGI.
Yes, exactly.
You completely stop caring about the character's emotional journey because your brain is just screaming that lighting doesn't match the background.
Precisely. A fantasy story has absolutely no defined imaginative limits when it comes to, the characters or the magical artifacts or the plot.
Do whatever you want with those.
Right. But the physical planet itself that accommodates the story, that has to be bound by real physical and scientific laws.
So we're talking about geomorphology, climate, biology.
Geopolitics, yeah. These aren't just dry academic subjects. They are the invisible hands shaping the drama of your fantasy.
And it is so terrifyingly easy to ignore their scientific element.
Oh, completely.
Because it's really tempting to say, look, there are fire-breathing lizards the size of houses in my world, so who really cares how the rivers flow?
That is the ultimate trap right there.
It is. Before we can even begin to populate our imaginary world with monsters or like complex magic systems, we have to physically build the planet.
From the crust up.
Literally from the crust up. We have to become geologists.
Which brings us to the absolute literal ground zero of world building.
The terrain.
The terrain. We are talking about the dirt, the rock, the physical canvas beneath the character's feet.
Okay, so let's get our hands dirty. The foundational step in mapping out a fantasy world is establishing this terrain. And we can break that down into two broad categories, right?
Yeah, horizontal and vertical.
So first, horizontal features. These are your rivers, your lakes, the sprawling forests, the blistering deserts.
Your murky swamps, yeah.
And second, we have your vertical features. These are the mountains piercing the sky, the rolling hills, the valleys, and, the volatile volcanoes.
And to place these features convincingly, a creator needs to grapple with two fundamental concepts.
Which are?
Geomorphology and topography.
Okay, geomorphology sounds like a terrifyingly dense word.
It does, but it's really just the study of how terrains form. It's the why and the how behind the landscape.
So like the invisible stuff.
Exactly. It's the deep, unseen geological processes that actually create the landforms over millions of years.
Got it. And topography.
Topography is the surface result. It's the what. It's how those features actually appear on the surface of your map when you finally draw it.
Now, I can already hear the collective groan from someone listening who just opened up a blank document and wanted to draw a really cool, intimidating, jagged coastline.
They're thinking, do I really need to learn geology to write a fantasy book?
Right. And the good news is, no, you don't need a PhD in earth sciences.
You don't need to enroll in university courses, I promise.
But you absolutely must understand the basic, high-level mechanisms of how landforms are created.
Because that underlying logic tells you exactly where things belong.
And that process starts with the absolute biggest landforms imaginable, the continents.
If we look at the history of our own planet, the most prominent scientific theories regarding the creation of continents revolve around continental drift and plate tectonics.
Which is fascinating stuff.
It really is. For a long time in human history, we thought continents were just these static, unmoving chunks of rock.
Just glued to the earth.
Right. But the reality, which is vital for a world builder to grasp, is that continents are in constant, agonizingly slow motion.
They're moving right now.
They are massive rafts of crust just floating on a sea of semi-liquid mantle. At some point in the deep, deep past, they were all connected in a massive supercontinent.
Like Pangaea.
Exactly like Pangaea. And at some point in the distant future, they will inevitably crash back together.
Okay, here's where I want to push back a little bit on behalf of the frustrated world builders out there.
Go for it.
Let's say I'm staring at a blank piece of paper. This is my universe. I am the god of this paper.
You are all powerful.
Right. So why can't I just draw a bunch of random cool-looking land masses wherever I feel like it?
Because of the nausea.
Well, wait. Let's say I want a big spiky one in the corner, a perfectly circular island in the middle, and a square continent at the bottom. Why does it matter if they were supposedly connected a million fictional years ago? Who is checking my fictional geological records?
That is the million-dollar question, really. And it goes right back to that concept of cognitive nausea we opened with.
Okay, so the brain rejects it.
Because the human brain is a terrifyingly adept pattern recognition machine.
Even if I know nothing about geology.
Even if your reader has never taken a single geology class, they have looked at maps of Earth their entire life. They intuitively know what a natural landmass looks like.
And nature doesn't draw up perfect squares.
No, it doesn't. Nature doesn't draw random spikes without a reason either. If you just draw disconnected, random shapes scattered across a page, it lacks an underlying structural logic.
So the brain subconsciously flags it as artificial.
Exactly. It feels drawn rather than formed.
Wait, I love that distinction. Drawn versus formed.
It's a huge difference.
It's like looking at a broken plate on the kitchen floor.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, because if you sweep the pieces of a broken ceramic plate into a pile, your brain can look at those shards and inherently understand that they could logically fit back together to form a whole object.
You can see the relationship between the edges.
Yes. But if you just cut out completely random shapes from different types of cardboard and threw them on the floor, your brain immediately knows they don't belong together. There's no relationship at all.
The illusion of a cohesive world is broken before the first chapter even begins.
That makes total sense.
And there is an incredibly practical, illustrative experiment you can do to prove this to yourself right now.
Oh, I love a good mapping hack. What is it?
If you take a blank piece of paper and just start drawing random shapes, maybe an oval here, a jagged star thing there, a blob in the corner.
Like most people do when they start out.
Right. And you look at that composition, the aesthetics of that map will feel completely wrong. Very few people will look at those shapes and accept them as a natural breathing world.
Because they're just floating islands of thought. They have no history with each other.
Precisely. But then try the alternative. Take a second piece of paper, draw a large, rough circle in the middle.
Okay, a big circle.
Now, take a pencil and draw jagged, cracking lines through that circle, dividing it into, say, 5 irregular intersecting puzzle pieces.
So you're fracturing it.
Yes. Then erase the boundary lines, pull those 5 irregular shapes apart, and place them in different spots on the paper. Rotate a few of them.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, almost like magic, you have a highly realistic, convincing continental map.
Because the negative spaces between those puzzle pieces automatically become your deep oceans and your sweeping seas.
Exactly. You vary the size of the initial pieces to get different sized continents, and you vary the distance you pull them apart to get different sized oceans.
It is a brilliantly simple hack. You're not just drawing, you're simulating deep time.
You really are.
If you look at a map of our real world, it looks exactly like a puzzle waiting for someone to slide the pieces back together.
South America and Africa famously look like they slot right into one another.
Because they used to?
Because they used to. A fantasy world, even though it is completely birthed from your mind, must carry that same aesthetic fingerprint of deep history to be considered realistic.
You start with your own fictional Pangaea, and then you let your fictional tectonic plates shatter it, spreading the oceans into the bleeding gaps.
It completely changes your relationship with the blank page. You aren't just an artist placing shapes anymore. You are defining the massive tectonic plates of your world.
And establishing those invisible plates is really the master key to unlocking everything that comes next.
Right. Without a doubt.
Because once we have these massive tectonic puzzle pieces placed on our map, we have to imagine the momentum of their movement.
They don't just stop.
Right. Over millennia, they're either drifting apart to form new oceans, or they are violently crashing into one another.
And it's those collisions that create the absolute vertical extremes of our map.
The Earth's crust crumbles, it buckles, and it thrusts upward into the atmosphere.
Which brings us to the architecture of extremes. The creation of mountains and volcanoes.
Okay, so this is where geomorphology forcefully dictates topography.
Exactly. And the foundational rule here that every creator must memorize is this. Mountains should never be scattered randomly across a map just to fill an empty space.
Oh my goodness, yes. How many amateur fantasy maps have we all seen where there's just a random, neat little clump of triangle mountains sitting right in the middle of a perfectly flat, square prairie?
Just because the author didn't know what else to put in that corner of the page?
It looks like a stamp, like they just used a rubber stamp of a mountain.
It's an incredibly common mistake. But mountains are not decorations. They are the scars of planetary trauma.
Scars of planetary trauma. I love that phrasing.
They exist precisely where those tectonic plates we just talked about are interacting. The constant grinding movement of tectonic plates that shattered your continents is the exact same violent force responsible for pushing up your mountains.
So they follow the fault lines.
Yes, and the mechanics of those collisions result in 3 very specific, distinct types of mountain formations.
I really want to linger on these because understanding the science here gives you such incredible organic tools for storytelling.
It really writes the story for you.
So the first type is the fold mountain. How does this work?
Think about two massive, heavy vehicles colliding head-on in slow motion.
Okay, two trucks crashing.
Right. Neither vehicle has the momentum to completely run over the other. So what happens?
The metal hoods crumple.
They buckle under the immense pressure and they fold upward, twisting into a jagged peak.
Ah, hence Fold Mountain.
Exactly. That is exactly what is happening to the Earth's crust, just scaled up to the size of continents and slowed down over millions of years.
You have two massive opposing tectonic plates slamming into each other.
And because neither plate gives way easily, their edges literally fold upward into the sky.
And what does that look like in the real world?
It creates the most massive, jagged, imposing mountain ranges on the planet. The Himalayas are the classic example.
Where the Indian plate is smashing into the Eurasian plate.
Right. The Andes, the Rockies, the Alps. Mount Everest is a fold mountain. These are colossal, almost impenetrable walls of rock.
So practically speaking, for our listener who is sitting there drawing a map,
Yeah.
if you have two of your puzzle pieces, your continents, crashing together on your fantasy map, you are going to get a massive Everest-style mountain range forming a spine right along that exact seam.
Exactly. It instantly gives you a natural border.
Okay, what about the second type?
The second type is the fault block mountain.
Fault block.
This happens when tectonic plates aren't necessarily crashing head-on, but rather grinding past each other or pulling apart in a way that creates extreme tension in the Earth's crust.
So they're sort of shearing.
Yeah. Eventually, the crust fractures. Massive fault lines appear. And the pressure causes immense continent-sized blocks of rock to tilt and thrust upward, while adjacent blocks drop down.
So one side grinds and tilts violently over the other.
Right.
I always picture this like a wooden trapdoor in the floor being forced open from underneath.
Oh, that's a perfect visual analogy.
Because one edge stays hinged to the ground, but the other edge is pushed high up into the air.
Because of that trapdoor effect, fault block mountains have a very distinct asymmetrical topography.
Asymmetrical meaning the sides are different.
Exactly. They often feature an incredibly steep, dramatic, almost vertical cliff face on one side, where the block fractured and lifted, and a much more gradual rolling slope on the other side.
Do we have real-world examples of that?
Oh, definitely. The Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, the Tetons in Wyoming, or the Harz Mountains in Germany.
Wait, think about the storytelling implications of a fault block mountain.
They're huge.
If you have an empire trying to invade a neighboring kingdom, and there's a fault block mountain range between them, the direction they are traveling changes everything.
It changes the entire campaign.
If they attack from the steep side, it's an impenetrable fortress wall. It's a suicide mission to climb it.
But if they attack from the gentle slope side...
It's a long, gradual march to the top.
Yeah.
The geology literally dictates military strategy.
Exactly. The science writes the plot for you. And that brings us to the third type, which is arguably the most dramatic and culturally significant for a fantasy writer.
The volcanic mountain. Bring on the fire and brimstone.
Right.
How do these differ from fold mountains?
Well, volcanic mountains occur at subduction zones.
Subduction, meaning one is going under.
Yes. This is when one tectonic plate is actively being driven underneath another plate, plunging deep into the Earth's fiery mantle.
That sounds intense.
It is. As that plate melts, it forces hyperpressurized magma, gases, and rock to violently rise up to the surface. It erupts.
And over thousands of eruptions, the cooled lava and ash build up.
To form a solitary, towering mountain. Mount Fuji in Japan or Mount St. Helens are prime examples.
Oh, so unlike long ranges of fold mountains, volcanoes often stand out as distinct solitary peaks.
Usually, yes, though they do often follow the curved line of the subduction zone.
Like the Ring of Fire.
Exactly like the Ring of Fire.
This is where world building becomes so deeply satisfying to me. By simply making a single geological decision, deciding how your imaginary tectonic plates interact, you are instantly generating the physical geography of your world.
You aren't just randomly decorating a map with pretty trees and hills.
No, you are building the physical barriers that will dictate where fictional empires can expand.
Where trade routes are forced to bottleneck.
And where armies are stopped dead in their tracks.
It creates a sense of profound authenticity. Now, it is worth noting that while tectonic plates are the primary architects of verticality, there are secondary forces at play.
Like erosion.
Yeah. Some smaller mountain ranges or dramatic canyons are formed purely by erosion. Massive rivers carving away softer rock around a high, solid plateau over eons.
But even then, the plateau had to be lifted by tectonic forces first.
Right. The plates are always the engine.
So let's take stock of our world so far. We have our continents slowly drifting and colliding, and from those collisions we have these massive towering vertical extremes, these jagged fold ranges, asymmetrical fault blocks, and smoldering volcanoes thrusting miles up into the sky.
It's coming together.
Now, these massive changes in elevation directly dictate how gravity affects the surface of the world. And gravity's most relentless, important job on a map is pulling water downward.
Which leads us to the arteries of any map, the water systems.
So let's talk about water.
When it comes to water, we need to make an immediate distinction. Oceans are the easy part.
Yeah, they're just the big blue spaces.
In most fantasy maps, oceans simply represent the endless, unmapped edges of the known world. Or they are the massive, negative space gaps between our continental puzzle pieces.
They are vast, they are deep, and aside from determining tidal patterns, they really don't require incredibly strict mapping rules from the creator.
Exactly. Inland water bodies, however, are a completely different and far more rigorous discipline.
Inland water is where amateur maps go to die.
They really are.
We are talking about rivers, lakes, streams, waterfalls. These features require strict, unforgiving obedience to physics.
They must have a logically defined origin point.
And they must have a defined, inescapable endpoint.
And this introduces the absolute golden, unbreakable rule of hydrology in fantasy cartography. If a world builder remembers nothing else from our deep dive today, it should be this.
Listen roll, please.
Rivers always flow downstream.
Always. Every single time.
It sounds so incredibly basic, almost insultingly simple, but it is violated constantly in fantasy writing.
Oh, I've seen it so many times.
Water is a slave to gravity. It will relentlessly seek the lowest possible elevation. It follows the path of least resistance.
Gravity is the law. A river cannot decide it wants to go visit the majestic elven kingdom on the other side of the map if that kingdom is uphill.
It just physically cannot happen.
So if water must go down, where does it start?
The sources of rivers can vary, but fundamentally they must start from areas of high elevation.
Those towering mountain ranges and rocky hills, we just spent all this time carefully poising along our tectonic fault lines.
That is exactly where your rivers are going to be born.
So they form from, like, melting snowcaps, massive glaciers, high-elevation springs bubbling up from the rock.
Or heavy rainfall catching in high-altitude bogs. But they always start high.
And where do they end?
Their ultimate destiny is the lowlands. The easiest, most logical endpoints for a river system are the massive oceanic basins or large lowland lakes and internal seas.
A river will almost never just arbitrarily disappear into the dry ground or abruptly stop in the middle of a map.
Unless you have invented a massive geologically specific reason for it to do so.
Right, like a porous limestone terrain that swallows the river into an expansive subterranean cavern system.
Which is a cool idea, but normally it just seeks a larger body of water.
There are a few incredibly common, frustrating mistakes that writers make when drawing rivers, and I think we need to highlight them so listeners know what to avoid.
Let's do it.
Mistake number 1. Starting a massive, roaring river in the middle of an open, flat grassland.
You see this all the time.
You can't just have the Amazon River suddenly materialize out of nowhere in the middle of a flat prairie.
Because there's no elevation to generate the kinetic flow.
And no massive catchment area to collect the rainwater or snowmelt. It makes no physical sense.
Mistake number 2, which is perhaps even more jarring, is having a river miraculously cross a mountain range.
Oh, this drives me crazy.
Yeah.
I've seen maps where a river flows neatly in a straight line right through a jagged line of mountains.
It is a classic violation of physics that triggers that exact cognitive nausea we discussed earlier.
Right, because water follows the path of least resistance.
Exactly. If a flowing river encounters a newly forming mountain range, it does not magically climb up and over the peaks.
It does one of two things. Right.
It either pools up to form a massive lake until it finds a way to spill over a lower pass, or it flows around the sides of the obstacle.
Carving deep, winding valleys and canyons over millennia, endlessly seeking the lowest possible path toward the sea. Yes, water is inherently lazy, but incredibly persistent. It always wants the easiest, fastest route down.
Another major misconception involves branching.
Oh, river splitting.
Rivers very frequently merge together as they flow downhill, smaller tributary streams joining to form a larger, wider river.
Like the branches of a tree coming down into the trunk.
Exactly, but rivers almost never split apart as they go down.
Unless they're hitting a completely flat, silty area right at the coast, which forms a delta.
Right, deltas are the exception. But inland, A river doesn't just neatly split in two to go visit two different cities.
That's a really crucial point. And speaking of the journey downward, let's talk about waterfalls.
Waterfalls are interesting.
In a fantasy story, a waterfall is often just treated as a romantic backdrop or a cool landmark for the heroes to camp near.
But geologically, a waterfall serves a very specific purpose on a map.
What does it signify?
It strictly signifies a sharp, sudden, dramatic downward change in terrain elevation. It indicates that the bedrock underneath the river suddenly shifted from a hard rock that resists erosion to a softer rock that washed away, creating a cliff.
So it is a visual geographical marker of shifting topography.
Exactly.
Because if you don't strictly map out your high elevation sources and your low elevation endpoints,
Yep.
and if you don't let gravity dictate the path between them, your rivers are just going to look like random, chaotic blue lines squiggled on a page by a toddler.
They won't look like they are embedded in the land. They will look like they are just floating on top of it.
So let's take a step back and look at the sequence of the physical world we've built so far.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We started with shifting, colliding continents. Those tectonic collisions pushed up jagged mountain ranges.
Those high mountain peaks captured the atmospheric moisture, birthing rivers that carved intricate gravity-bound paths down through the valleys toward the oceans.
We have successfully created a dynamic, functioning physical skeleton. But right now, it is a barren world.
It's completely dead.
It is just bare, gray rock and flowing water.
Right, we have the scaffolding. Now we need to put some flesh on it.
We need to paint the canvas. Because with those massive mountains standing tall to block the atmospheric winds and those sprawling river systems flowing outward to distribute fresh water across the plains, that bare rock is about to undergo a radical transformation.
The topography and the hydrology working in tandem determine the absolute biological canvas of the world.
Which brings us to the concept of ground cover and climate.
Ground cover is the collective term for the biological skin of your world.
The dense forests, the murky swamps, the blistering deserts, the frozen tundras.
And the sprawling grasslands, yeah.
And the vital, non-negotiable rule here is that the type of ground cover you place in any specific area of your map is not random.
It is entirely dictated by 4 intersecting factors.
Terrain, altitude, water presence, soil type, and the overarching climate.
You don't just get to draw a spooky swamp wherever you feel like it because your necromancer villain needs a cool place to live.
The aesthetics of cartography break down pretty logically. Green areas represent vegetation and water-rich biomes.
Brown areas represent the dry, arid, or rocky zones.
And white and gray areas represent the freezing, snow-covered, high-altitude regions.
Let's analyze where these biomes belong based on the scientific rules we've established. Let's start with the green zones.
The water-rich areas like dense jungles, temperate forests, and swamps. Where do they go?
They must occupy the lower elevated areas of your map, or the gentle slopes leading down from the mountains.
Because they fundamentally indicate the presence of a nearby, reliable water body.
You need a massive river system, a sprawling lake, the coastal moisture from the sea, or substantial shallow groundwater to sustain that much plant life.
So if I am drawing a massive, ancient, impenetrable forest for my elves to live in, I absolutely must draw a significant water source feeding it.
You can't just put a lush green circle in the middle of a brown desert continent.
Exactly. These green lowlands also signify a climate with a consistent, heavy, rainy season.
And crucially for a storyteller, because of the abundance of water and warmth, these areas house the absolute highest number of plant and animal species.
This is where your world's dense, chaotic biodiversity thrives.
Okay, so that's the lowlands. It's warm, it's wet, it's teeming with life. What about the other extreme? What about the high elevations?
The ground cover for highly elevated areas is generally restricted to rocky mountainous regions, cold, windswept deserts, and areas permanently covered in ice and snow.
These are your white and gray zones on the map.
Right. Because the altitude makes the air thin and freezing, and because the water is often locked in ice, these regions are incredibly harsh.
In stark contrast to the buzzing, overgrown life of the lowlands, these high-elevation areas are isolated, brutal, and they boast a very low number of specialized plant and animal species.
It's pure survival territory.
And this stark contrast between the lush green lowlands and the brutal white peaks brings us to one of the most important conceptual rules for realistic mapping.
The rule of gradual transitions.
This is where a lot of fantasy maps fail the reality check.
I like to use a visual analogy for this. Think of your map's climates like a color gradient tool in a graphic design program.
Blending seamlessly from one shade to another.
Yes. It should never look like a sharp, hard line drawn with a thick black marker. It is geologically and climatically impossible to transition directly from a freezing, snow-covered glacial biome to a sweltering, sun-baked sand desert in the span of a single mile.
You cannot have a wall of ice directly touching a sand dune.
Nature abhors a sharp line. The transition from one extreme type of ground cover to the next must be gradual, logical, and dictated by the changing moisture and temperature.
When bordering wildly different areas on your map, you must invent a realistic transition zone.
Let's walk through a hypothetical example. If you have a lush, dense, rain-soaked jungle region, how does it end?
It doesn't just stop at a line.
Right. As the moisture levels naturally taper off, that jungle is going to thin out into a lighter, temperate forest.
Then the trees will grow further apart, fading into a sprawling, tall grass savanna.
As it gets drier, that savanna turns into a scrubland with tough, drought-resistant bushes.
And finally, when the moisture is almost gone, it transitions into an arid desert.
The environment slowly steps down.
And that leads us to a fascinating geographical phenomenon that every world builder should know: the rain shadow effect.
Oh, this perfectly explains how deserts form. Let's really dig into the rain shadow because this is such a cool mechanism.
Imagine the prevailing winds of your world sweeping in off the ocean. These winds are heavy, carrying massive clouds thick with moisture.
They blow inland, across the green coastal forests, watering the land.
But then they encounter one of those massive fold mountain ranges we built earlier.
The mountains act as a towering physical wall.
The wind cannot go through them, so it is forced to push the heavy clouds up the slope of the mountain.
As the clouds go higher into the colder atmosphere, they condense.
Exactly. I like to think of the mountain like a giant rocky fist squeezing a sponge.
Squeezing a sponge, that's a great image.
As the clouds are forced up, the mountain squeezes all the water out of them in the form of heavy rain or snow on that side of the peak.
So by the time those clouds finally crest the summit and roll down the other side of the mountain range, they are completely empty.
They have no moisture left to give, so the land on the far side of the mountain receives no rain.
It becomes a barren, dry, rocky wasteland.
That is a rain-shadowed desert.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
It connects everything. The tectonic plates made the mountain squeezed the clouds, and the lack of rain made the desert.
So if you want to place a harsh, dry desert on your map, it shouldn't just be randomly placed.
A desert makes the most logical sense when it is bordered by a massive, dry, mountainous region, the rain shadow wall, which blocks the moisture from reaching it.
Navigating all these intersecting climates, understanding prevailing winds, the rain shadow, atmospheric pressure, solar heat, humidity, latitude, altitude.
It can seem paralyzingly overwhelming for a writer.
It really can. You start to feel like you need a supercomputer just to figure out if it should rain in Chapter 3.
It's enough to make anyone give up and just write their story in a featureless gray void.
But thankfully, the framework provides an incredibly brilliant, mathematically simple hack for determining weather and climate.
I adore this hack because it saves so much frustration. You do not need to calculate precise temperatures or barometric pressures for your fantasy world.
Instead, simply look at your continental map and pick two extreme anchor points.
Identify the single absolute coldest point on your map and the single absolute hottest point.
Right. And based on all the science we just walked through, determining those spots is easy.
The absolute coldest part of your map is naturally going to be your highest altitude, towering mountain ranges, where the landmass is situated at the extreme north and south poles, covered in permanent ice.
And the hottest part of your map is going to be your low elevation areas near the equator.
Either a sweltering, humid jungle basin or a completely dry, sun-baked, rain-shadowed desert.
Once you lock in those two absolute extremes, your freezing anchor and your boiling anchor, everything else in the middle basically solves itself through interpolation.
The climate becomes a natural spectrum between your 2 points.
The areas close to the cold pole will be cool, pine forests and tundras.
The areas in the middle latitudes will be temperate, experiencing changing seasons, moderate rainfall, and varied vegetation.
And the closer you get to the hot anchor, the warmer and more extreme the environment becomes.
And this has massive narrative applications. Even in a world filled with magic, the weather must correspond to the region.
If your characters are experiencing a brutal, blinding, life-threatening sandstorm, they need to actually be located in a geologically accurate desert region.
Likely caught in a rain shadow.
Exactly. The weather isn't just a random event to make the hero suffer. It is a character born directly from the map.
So let's look at the incredible tapestry we've woven. We have drifting continents that smash together to forge towering mountains.
Those mountains captured the rain and birthed rivers that carved valleys down to the oceans.
The mountains block the wind, and the rivers water the earth, dictating precisely where the lush forests grew and where the harsh deserts dried out.
We have established a thriving, logically consistent, scientifically sound environment with distinct climates and perfect gradual transitions.
We have a planet. Now it is finally time to populate it.
This is the fun part.
How does this incredibly rigid scientific foundation we've built shape the truly fantastical elements of the story?
How does the gravity and the climate shape the mythical beasts, the terrifying monsters, and the magical flora?
This is where we delve into evolutionary fantasy.
And there is a very perceptive observation to be made here about human nature and the creative process.
Oh, about where people start.
Yeah. This step inventing the crazy biodiversity, the terrifying monsters, the bizarre alien plants, is usually where most writers actually want to start their world-building process.
Oh, absolutely. The boundless nature of imagination makes creating bizarre human-like species or terrifying multi-headed monsters incredibly fun and appealing.
People often just invent a creature out of thin air because it sounds visually awesome.
Like, I want a giant six-legged venomous ice spider.
And then they try to hastily reverse engineer a flimsy explanation for it later in the story when the reader inevitably asks, wait, what does that thing eat?
Which is exactly backward, according to the scientific framework we are using.
It insists, without a single exception, that animal and plant species, whether they are normal, real-world animals or completely magical, impossible fantasy monsters, must be influenced by their immediate surrounding environment.
Their evolution has to make biological sense.
Biology is destiny, even for monsters.
The physical appearance of an animal species, its color, its bone structure, its defensive capabilities, all of it is designed by nature to help it survive, blend in, and adapt to the specific biome it lives in.
Skin coating or fur acts as camouflage to hide from predators or to silently ambush prey.
It also acts as a vital temperature-regulating blanket.
Let's look at how this applies to mythological creatures. It's fascinating to see how the ancient myths of our own real world intuitively followed these biological rules.
Our ancestors understood evolutionary biology subconsciously long before they had the scientific language for it.
I love this part. Let's analyze mythological placement based on the environment.
Let's start with those freezing, snowy, high-altitude mountain peaks we built.
If you are creating a monster to live on a freezing glacier, what does it biologically need to survive?
First, it needs a way to retain heat, so it needs incredibly thick fur or blubber.
Second, it needs camouflage to hunt in a blindingly white environment, so it needs white or pale blue coloring.
And what are the classic myths that live there? The Yeti, the abominable snowman.
Even a fantasy creation like a massive flying white bear monster works perfectly there. Its morphology makes sense.
But if you took that exact same white, heavily furred Yeti and dropped it into a humid, murky green swamp,
It would look utterly absurd.
it would overheat and die or stick out like a sore thumb to every predator.
Exactly. The environment dictates the design. Now let's move down into the dense, dark forest areas.
Creatures hiding in the heavy shadows of the woods need dark fur, mottled brown or black coloring to blend in with the tree trunks, the dead leaves, and the earth.
And the myths we find native to the woods. Bigfoot, werewolves, giant spiders.
Their physical morphology perfectly matches the low light levels, the dense cover, and the terrain of an ancient forest.
What about water proximity?
If you have creatures living near the oceans or hunting in those massive rivers we drew, they require aquatic adaptations.
They need a way to move through water efficiently and perhaps breathe underwater.
Gills, webbed appendages, fins, sleek, hydrodynamic bodies.
Hence, the universal myths of mermaids, sirens, or the Loch Ness Monster.
You don't put a sleek, finned Loch Ness monster in a dry canyon.
And speaking of dry canyons, what evolutionary traits belong in the desert?
A creature living under the hot, punishing sun needs a light-colored coat to reflect the intense solar radiation or thick reptilian scales to prevent its internal moisture from evaporating.
It needs to be incredibly efficient with water.
So in the desert, we find myths of massive, brown, reptilian lizard monsters, giant scorpions, or sandworms.
Even the magical flora adapts. You might design magical, moving, snake-like cactus plants that hunt for water beneath the dunes.
The overarching lesson here is that magic does not negate the biological imperative to survive.
I think sometimes fantasy writers use magic as a lazy excuse to ignore ecology.
Why does the giant spider live on the glacier? Because magic.
But that creates the nausea. If we look at the bigger picture, camouflage and morphological features are survival mechanisms.
Let's look at a classic fantasy trope.
Um,
The wise, ancient, giant talking tree.
an ent, essentially.
Where does a creature like that logically belong?
It belongs deep in a water-rich, undisturbed ancient forest, where a tree could believably access enough nutrients and water to grow to an immense magical size over thousands of years.
It absolutely does not belong perched on top of a barren, frozen glacier where the soil is solid rock and there is no liquid water.
The geography of the world forces the evolutionary traits of the fantasy species.
It's Darwinian natural selection applied to magic. You aren't restricting your creativity by following these biological rules. You are actually grounding it, making it more terrifying and real.
If a dragon breathes fire, maybe it's because it evolved near those volcanic subduction zones we discussed.
And it ingests sulfur and specific minerals to create a biological ignition inside its body.
When your reader encounters your terrifying, a brown-scaled lizard monster in the deep, waterless desert, their brain instantly registers, yes, that creature belongs here.
It evolved over millions of years to survive this specific harsh place.
The cognitive nausea is avoided. The illusion holds firm.
And this evolutionary logic applies to plants just as strictly as animals.
Woody, leafy plants with massive root systems occupy the water-rich, deep soil areas.
Cacti, succulents, and hardy scrub brush occupy the dry, sandy zones.
The fantastical flora you invent must reflect the rainfall, the sunlight, and the soil we mapped out in the very beginning.
Okay, so we have continents, mountains, rivers, biomes. And now we have wildly creative but biologically logical plants and animals perfectly adapted to survive in those biomes.
But animals mostly just adapt to survive.
Intelligent species, humans, elves, dwarves, or whatever human-like species you've created, they do more than just survive.
They build, they conquer, they hoard, they worship.
Ultimately, the geography and the biology we've painstakingly built dictate the absolute most complex web of all, civilization.
Which leads us to the culmination of our world-building journey, the geopolitics of make-believe.
Geopolitics sounds like a staggeringly dry academic term for a discussion about dragons and wizards.
But it is the pulsing engine of conflict in almost every great story ever written.
At its core, geopolitics is simply the study of how the interactions, the wars, and the alliances of human or human-like species are directly influenced by geographical factors.
Specifically, boundaries, borders, terrain advantages, and access to natural resources.
And to truly understand how to map out civilizations, we need to introduce a real, actual scientific law from the field of geography called Tobler's first law of geography.
I had to read this a couple of times to really let the simplicity and power of it sink in.
Tobler's first law states, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things.
It is an incredibly elegant, almost poetic summation of human history, and it applies perfectly to fantasy world building.
Think about what happens when two nations, or two distinct tribes of fantasy races, share a border.
Because they share a border, they are near things.
So let's break down what this actually means for the listener who is trying to write a political conflict in their story. Let's apply Tobler's law.
It means that neighboring lands, precisely because they are physically near each other, are inherently entangled.
They cannot ignore each other. Two bordering kingdoms are generally going to fall into one of two extreme categories.
They are either going to be tight, heavily reliant, intermingled allies, or they're going to be fierce, bitter, hostile competitors.
There is very rarely neutrality between neighbors.
And the reason for that binary extreme relationship is the geography we built in step one.
They're either mutually sharing the abundant resources of the land through trade, or they're violently competing for scarce resources out of desperation.
Let's do a hypothetical scenario to illustrate this. Remember those rivers we carefully mapped flowing from the mountains to the sea?
Let's say a massive life-giving river flows down from the mountains, passes through Kingdom A, and then continues downstream into Kingdom B before hitting the ocean.
Because Kingdom A is upstream, they physically control Kingdom B's water supply.
That single geographic reality dictates their entire political relationship.
If Kingdom A decides to build a massive dam to irrigate their own crops, Kingdom B suffers a devastating drought.
Kingdom B now has to either go to war to destroy the dam, or they have to submit and become a vassal state, offering tribute in exchange for water.
The geography created the political crisis.
Tobler's law also dictates the culture, the appearance, and the biology of these neighboring peoples.
Because they are near things occupying similar climates, they will likely look physically similar and share deep, common cultural roots.
The physical appearance of human-like species reflects their environment, just like the monsters we discussed.
Species evolving over thousands of years in hot, dry, sun-exposed areas of the map will naturally develop darker skin tones for melanin protection against the radiation.
Compared to species isolated in the cold, dark, snow-covered northern areas who develop pale skin to maximize vitamin D absorption from limited sunlight.
It grounds the diverse populations of your world in scientific reality, but it goes beyond just physical appearance.
The geography fundamentally shapes the very soul of the civilization.
Their traditions, their customs, their diets, and their religions.
Faith mirrors the map.
Absolutely. Think about how a civilization interacts with its environment.
A civilization that lives in a brutal, scorching, rain-shadowed desert is highly likely to have a religion deeply centered around the sun.
Perhaps worshiping it as a vital giver of life, or fearing it as a wrathful, punishing deity that demands sacrifice.
Their holy symbols, their architecture, their clothing will all reflect a society built around surviving the heat. Sun worshippers naturally arise from sun-exposed lands.
Right. You wouldn't find a culture of sun worshippers living deep in a subterranean cave system.
And what about magic? If magic is a real, tangible force in your world, how is it practiced? How is it culturally integrated?
Magic should be treated as a natural resource tied to the terrain.
If you have a society of magical herbalists, witches, or druids who brew powerful potions, they will naturally originate from the deep, water-rich forest areas where the biodiversity of plant life is the highest.
They have access to the raw materials.
Meanwhile, magicians who draw their power from taming or harvesting the magical energy of massive aquatic beasts are obviously going to build their academies and cities right on the riverbanks or the rocky coastlines.
The magic is local. It is an evolutionary adaptation of the culture to the geography.
Now contrast all of those connected, entangled near things with the distant, terrifying unknown.
Now, the second half of Tobler's law implies that distant things are less related.
Geographic distance naturally breeds unfamiliarity, isolation, and divergence.
Think back to those massive Everest-style fold mountains we built in the very beginning.
Those jagged peaks act as an impassable physical wall, separating two halves of a continent for tens of thousands of years.
The civilizations on either side of that mountain range evolve in complete isolation from one another.
So what happens in your story when a brave explorer from the deep, magical, potion-brewing forest society finally figures out a way to cross those impossible mountains?
And for the first time in history, encounters a civilization of pale, sun-fearing ice dwellers from the high, snowy peaks.
It is a profound, world-shattering collision of cultures.
They are completely alien to one another.
Their physical appearances, their clothing, their diets, their deeply held religions, their entire understanding of how magic works, everything is fundamentally, jarringly different because the environments that birthed them are fundamentally different.
And that extreme geographic difference perfectly explains the resulting culture shock.
That unfamiliarity naturally attracts curiosity, but also deep suspicion, fear, and in many cases, violent prejudice.
Those raw emotions, curiosity, suspicion, prejudice, fear of the unknown, those are the sparks that ignite the plot's central conflicts.
When massive alliances form, or when catastrophic world-ending wars break out in your story, the geographical locations and the distribution of natural resources we mapped out should be able to instantly explain why those decisions are being made.
It completely removes the arbitrary nature of bad, lazy writing.
The evil king didn't just declare war on the neighboring elves because he's a generic bad guy who likes being evil.
He declared war because the neighboring elven kingdom controls the only navigable mountain pass that leads to the sea, and his people are starving and desperately need access to oceanic salt and fish to survive the coming winter.
The geography drives the political desperation.
Every cultural nuance, every complex political treaty, every religious schism, and every bloody war can be traced backward down an unbroken chain of logic.
From the culture, to the biology, to the climate, to the flowing rivers, to the towering mountains, and finally all the way down to the grinding tectonic plates shifting in the dark beneath the crust.
It is a holistic, interconnected system. And that is what makes a fantasy world feel as real and as heavy and as lived in as our own planet Earth.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. Let's take a moment to look back at the incredible journey we've taken and recap what we've actually built for you, the listener.
We started with nothing but a blank page and the limitless void of imagination.
But instead of just drawing random floating shapes, We laid down shifting tectonic plates. We built the continental puzzle, mimicking the deep history of Pangaea.
Then we let those massive plates collide and grind against each other, pushing up mathematically logical, scientifically accurate fold mountains, asymmetrical fault blocks, and violent volcanic ranges.
We established the architecture of extremes.
From those high freezing elevations, we mapped the flow of life.
We ensured that every single river obeyed the unforgiving law of gravity, carving lazy, winding paths down through the valleys toward the oceanic lowlands.
We never let a river randomly start in a flat plain, and we never let water magically climb over a mountain peak.
With the mountains standing tall to block the moisture-heavy winds and the rivers watering the earth below, we painted the biological canvas.
We established logical, thriving biomes, dense forests, expansive savannas, and harsh rain shadow deserts.
We used smooth, gradual color gradients and transitions, utilizing the incredibly simple hack of anchoring our climate with the hottest and coldest extremes.
That stable, logical environment then forced the evolutionary biology of the world.
The terrifying monsters and the magical plants weren't just random cool ideas. They were designed with camouflage, thermoregulation, and morphological traits perfectly suited to survive their specific localized biomes.
The white yeti started on the glacier, and the brown lizard stayed in the desert.
And finally, that unquestionable biological and geographical reality birthed the complex geopolitics.
The uneven distribution of resources and the natural impenetrable borders dictated the religions, the conflicts, the desperate alliances, and the cultural prejudices of the civilizations inhabiting the map.
By committing to building your world from the crust up, you have created a masterpiece that subconsciously tells the reader on every single page, in every single chapter. This place makes sense.
The brain relaxes, the cognitive background check clears, the illusion is flawless.
The framework leaves us with that crucial final warning about the nausea of a disorganized world.
The human brain, above all else, demands order and recognizable patterns.
A truly successful, immersive foray into fantasy requires you to deeply respect the audience's psychological need for reality.
You must sprinkle the rigid, uncompromising rules of real-life science into the boundless pool of imagination.
That science is the anchor. It holds the reader's subconscious steady, preventing them from getting mentally seasick while you take them on a wild, magical journey.
I think that is the absolute perfect way to look at it. The science isn't a cage restricting your creativity, it's an anchor securing it.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day, or as you sit down at your keyboard tonight to write your own epic story.
Oh, this is a good one.
We just spent this entire deep dive talking about the absolute non-negotiable necessity of constructing an incredibly rigid, scientifically perfect fantasy world.
A world where gravity always works, where evolution makes perfect sense, and where mountains dictate the weather.
But think about this. What happens to the reader's psychology when you spend all that time establishing those perfect, unbreakable rules, and then you intentionally break just one of them?
Oh, that's fascinating.
If you build a flawless, scientifically grounded world that the reader completely trusts,
Right.
and then suddenly, halfway through the book, the heroes stumble into a single cursed valley where the rivers actually do flow uphill.
Think about the impact.
Because you took the time to build a world where everything else makes perfect scientific sense, that one single magical anomaly becomes infinitely more terrifying, unsettling, and awe-inspiring than a poorly built world where nothing makes sense to begin with.
When science establishes the baseline of reality, magic becomes a true miracle.